Imagine a prison built for 400 but crammed with more than 7,000 human beings, packed so tightly that standing became a way of life and survival was a daily gamble. To understand the horror that unfolded within the walls of Gitarama Prison, we must first travel back to the years leading up to 1994, a period that would plunge Rwanda into one of the darkest chapters of modern human history. Rwanda, a small, densely populated country in Central Africa, was home primarily to two ethnic groups, the Hutu majority and the Tutsi minority. Tensions between these groups were not new. They were the product of decades, even centuries, of complex social hierarchies, colonial manipulation, and political power struggles. During the colonial period, Belgian rulers exacerbated ethnic divisions by classifying people based on their physical appearance and ancestry. They issued ethnic identity cards, favoring the Tutsi minority for administrative positions and leadership roles. This system entrenched resentment among the Hutu majority, who felt marginalized in their own homeland. After Rwanda gained independence in 1962, the power dynamics reversed. The Hutu took control of the government, leading to cycles of violence, discrimination, and revenge attacks between the two communities. Many Tutsis were forced into exile, creating a diaspora determined to one day return. In 1990, a group of Tutsi exiles formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF) and launched a military invasion from Uganda, aiming to overthrow the Hutu-led government. This sparked a brutal civil war, deepening mistrust and paranoia within the country. Propaganda became a powerful weapon. Radio stations and newspapers spread hateful messages, portraying Tutsis as enemies and traitors. Political leaders, extremist militias, and influential figures used fear as a tool to mobilize ordinary citizens against their neighbors. The fragile peace collapsed on the evening of April 6, 1994, when the plane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down near Kigali. His death acted as the trigger. Within hours, roadblocks were erected across the country and well-organized killing squads began their deadly mission. Over the next 100 days, Rwanda descended into unimaginable chaos. Approximately 800,000 to 1 million people, mostly Tutsis and moderate Hutus, were slaughtered with terrifying speed and brutality. It wasn't just soldiers or militias who participated. Many civilians were drawn into the violence, turning the genocide into a nationwide massacre. As the RPF advanced and eventually took control of the country, the genocide ended. But what followed was a massive wave of arrests. The new government, seeking justice and accountability, detained anyone suspected of participating in the killings. However, the scale of the arrests was unprecedented. By late 1994, more than 120,000 people had been imprisoned across the country. Rwanda's prison system, already fragile and limited, was suddenly overwhelmed. It was within this turbulent historical context that Gitarama Prison became a symbol of the post-genocide nightmare. Built decades earlier by Belgian colonial authorities, the facility was intended to house around 400 inmates. It was never designed to handle thousands of detainees at once. Yet, after the genocide, wave after wave of suspects were brought in, filling every cell, corridor, and open space. The government lacked resources, infrastructure, and international support to manage the sudden influx of prisoners. Many of those arrested were not tried or convicted. They were simply detained while investigations and trials were planned, a process that moved at a painfully slow pace given the staggering number of suspects. Overcrowding in prisons was not just a logistical issue, it reflected the scale of Rwanda's trauma. Entire communities had been torn apart, and now, thousands of alleged perpetrators were locked up in facilities that could barely sustain a fraction of their numbers. The international community's role during this period was complex. The United Nations had failed to intervene effectively during the genocide, and in its aftermath, Rwanda faced isolation and limited assistance. Human rights groups raised alarms about the conditions in detention centers, but the government argued that it was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. Justice mechanisms like the Gacaca courts were introduced later as a community-based solution to handle the immense caseload. But in the immediate years after 1994, prisons bore the full weight of post-genocide justice. Gitarama Prison, located in southern Rwanda, soon became notorious. As thousands of detainees poured in, the facility's population exploded. Men suspected of participating in genocide killings, whether guilty or not, were packed into cells with barely any space to move. Many were never formally charged for years. The overcrowding was so severe that prisoners spent their days standing shoulder to shoulder, unable to sit or lie down. This was the direct consequence of a nation attempting to process a cataclysmic tragedy through a legal and penal system that had been shattered by war. The historical background of Gitarama Prison is not just about dates and events, it's about how a country torn apart by ethnic hatred, political collapse, and mass violence ended up creating a new humanitarian disaster inside its own walls. The genocide didn't just produce victims in the fields and streets, it produced victims behind bars as well. Understanding this history is crucial because it shows how the seeds of what happened in Gitarama were sown long before the prison reached its breaking point. It was the culmination of decades of division, colonial legacy, political failure, and international neglect. To understand the unimaginable scenes that unfolded in Gitarama Prison after the genocide, it is essential to recognize what the prison was originally built for and how its purpose was transformed by one of the worst human tragedies of the 20th century. Gitarama Prison was never meant to become a holding ground for tens of thousands of suspects, nor was it designed to endure years of mass detention. Its original purpose was modest and bureaucratic, to house a limited number of inmates awaiting trial or serving short sentences, within a legal and penal system shaped by colonial administration and later adapted by the Rwandan state. Constructed during the Belgian colonial era, Gitarama Prison was part of a broader network of penal institutions meant to maintain order, enforce colonial authority, and control the local population. These prisons were not built with rehabilitation in mind, they were tools of governance. Gitarama, in particular, was strategically located in the southern region of Rwanda, close to administrative centers, making it a convenient site for processing detainees from surrounding districts. Its capacity was estimated to be around 400 prisoners, a number reflecting Rwanda's relatively small pre-genocide prison population and the colonial government's limited investment in large-scale detention infrastructure. After Rwanda gained independence in 1962, Gitarama Prison continued to operate under the new national government, retaining much of its colonial structure and purpose. Like many other prisons across the country, it was used mainly to detain common criminals, petty offenders, and individuals awaiting judicial proceedings. Rwanda's penal system remained underdeveloped, with little modernization or expansion over the following decades. Prisons like Gitarama functioned with minimal staff, limited medical care, and very basic facilities, yet within this modest framework, they managed to fulfill their original role, containing a controlled number of inmates in a relatively stable legal environment. That purpose changed dramatically in the aftermath of the 1994 Rwandan genocide. In the chaotic months that followed the mass killings, the newly established government launched a nationwide campaign to arrest individuals suspected of participating in the genocide. This included not only those accused of organizing massacres, but also ordinary citizens suspected of having taken part in the violence, either through direct involvement or indirect support. The goal was to bring these individuals to justice and to restore a sense of order to a country shattered by ethnic hatred and mass murder. However, Rwanda's legal and prison systems were utterly unprepared for the scale of this operation. Courts had been disrupted, many judicial personnel had been killed or had fled, and physical infrastructure lay in ruins. Yet the number of arrests grew exponentially. By late 1994, over 120,000 people had been detained nationwide. With no functional trial system in place, prisons were turned into temporary holding centers for suspects whose legal cases could take years to process. Gitarama Prison became one of the primary detention sites for these suspects. Its purpose shifted almost overnight, from housing a few hundred local offenders to acting as a central repository for thousands of genocide suspects, many of whom were arrested en masse with little evidence or formal charges at the time. The government, facing immense pressure both internally and internationally to hold perpetrators accountable, began using every available space to contain detainees. School buildings, stadiums, military barracks, and eventually prisons like Gitarama were filled to capacity. Gitarama's geographical location played a major role in this transformation. Situated in the heart of the country, it became a convenient hub for transferring large groups of detainees from various regions. The facility's original administrative function was stretched far beyond its intended limits. Cells built for 10 men suddenly held 50. Courtyards were filled with prisoners day and night. The prison ceased to be merely a correctional institution. It became a warehouse of human beings, a place to keep suspects while the state tried to figure out how to manage an unprecedented legal crisis. The authorities believed that by concentrating suspects in centralized prisons, they could better control the population and prepare for eventual trials. On paper, this made sense: keep the accused in one place, prevent escape, and allow investigators to work systematically. But in practice, this repurposing had devastating consequences. The infrastructure was never expanded to match the new population. Sanitation facilities remained the same as they had been for 400 inmates. Food supplies were limited. Medical care was almost non-existent. And crucially, there was no realistic timeline for legal proceedings. Many prisoners would remain in Gitarama for years, awaiting trial, often without formal charges. Gitarama Prison thus came to represent a collision between purpose and reality. Its original design reflected a stable, small-scale penal system. Its new role reflected the overwhelming burden of post-genocide justice in a country on the brink of collapse. The building itself, with its narrow corridors, small cells, and limited yard space, became a physical symbol of how Rwanda's legal ambitions exceeded its capacity. It was not only a prison, it was an improvised solution to a national emergency. This transformation was also influenced by political pressures. The Rwandan government needed to show the population and the international community that justice was being pursued. Detaining suspects en masse was a way to demonstrate control and commitment to accountability. Gitarama became one of the key sites used to communicate that message. Even as conditions inside spiraled into catastrophe, overcrowding was not initially seen as a humanitarian issue. It was seen as a temporary necessity in the wake of a national trauma. Unfortunately, temporary turned into years. The purpose of Gitarama Prison was thus fundamentally reshaped in a matter of weeks. From a modest colonial-era detention center, it became a central holding ground for the accused in the aftermath of genocide, a place where the nation's unresolved pain and quest for justice were literally locked behind walls. But the building, the staff, and the system were never designed for this role. What was meant to be an administrative tool of justice turned into an overcrowded, disease-ridden, and deadly space that would soon gain international notoriety. The true nightmare of Gitarama Prison emerged not just from its purpose, but from the sheer scale of overcrowding that followed the genocide. In the months after April 1994, the prison, originally built to hold around 400 inmates, was suddenly forced to contain more than 7,000 detainees at once. This was not a gradual increase over years. It was a rapid and overwhelming influx that turned the facility into one of the most dangerously congested prisons in modern history. To grasp the scale of this overcrowding, imagine a building meant to accommodate a small community being turned overnight into a holding ground for an entire town. Cells designed for 10 or 15 men were packed with 50 or more. Corridors became makeshift living spaces. Courtyards, meant for short daily breaks, became permanent holding areas. There was no space left unused. Every inch of the prison was filled with human bodies. Detainees stood shoulder to shoulder, often unable to sit or lie down. Many spent months in this state, sleeping while standing, leaning against walls or one another to rest. The overcrowding was the direct result of mass arrests following the genocide. The government detained anyone suspected of participating in the killings, ranging from militia members to ordinary civilians accused by neighbors. Many were arrested without formal charges or evidence, as the judicial system was still in disarray. Investigations took months, sometimes years, and during that time, the suspects had to be held somewhere. With few functioning prisons left, Gitarama became a central dumping ground for detainees. Transfer trucks would arrive day and night, unloading dozens, sometimes hundreds, of new prisoners into an already suffocating environment. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Ventilation was poor, with most cells lacking windows or proper airflow. The walls, originally meant to house a small population, trapped heat and moisture, creating an unbearable atmosphere. Prisoners reported that the stench of sweat, urine, feces, and decay filled every corner of the building. Basic sanitation facilities, such as toilets and water taps, were designed for a few hundred inmates, not thousands. Latrines overflowed, contaminating the limited water supply and turning the prison into a breeding ground for disease. Food supplies were another critical issue. The prison's kitchen facilities were incapable of feeding thousands of people. Rations were meager and irregular. Many prisoners received only one small meal a day, sometimes consisting of thin porridge or beans, often spoiled or insufficient. Malnutrition became widespread. In such crowded conditions, the weak were often pushed aside. Those who couldn't stand for long periods or fight their way to the food distribution areas simply starved. Survival depended not only on strength but also on position. Those near the front of the crowd might eat, while those trapped at the back went hungry. Water scarcity worsened the crisis. With so many people packed into the facility, water tanks emptied quickly, and the infrastructure couldn't keep up with demand. Prisoners often drank from contaminated sources, leading to outbreaks of dysentery, diarrhea, and other waterborne diseases. There was little to no medical care available. Minor illnesses spread rapidly and became deadly in such unsanitary, overcrowded conditions. The physical toll was devastating, but the psychological impact was equally severe. Prisoners were stripped of basic human dignity. They lived in constant proximity to death. Detainees collapsed from exhaustion, disease, or suffocation on a daily basis. Corpses sometimes remained in cells for hours before being removed, as the sheer number of deaths overwhelmed the prison's ability to manage them. Inmates became numb to suffering. Some accounts describe people standing on the bodies of the dead to make space for themselves on the cell floor. The line between the living and the dead blurred inside Gitarama's overcrowded walls. The overcrowding was not just a humanitarian failure. It was a structural one. The Rwandan legal system could not process the immense number of genocide-related cases quickly enough. Trials were delayed for years, and prisoners languished in detention without resolution. International human rights organizations began reporting on the horrific conditions in Rwandan prisons, with Gitarama frequently cited as one of the worst examples. But even with global attention, the situation remained largely unchanged for a long time. The government lacked the resources to build new facilities or provide adequate supplies, and international aid was slow to address the crisis inside the prisons. Within this environment, disease became a more lethal threat than violence. Gangrene, dysentery, cholera, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases spread unchecked. Overcrowded cells made isolation of sick prisoners impossible. A single infected individual could spread illness to dozens in a matter of days. Medical treatment was minimal, antibiotics and disinfectants were scarce. The lack of sunlight, fresh air, and hygiene further weakened prisoners' immune systems, accelerating the death toll. Reports from humanitarian groups estimated that hundreds of inmates died every month at the peak of the crisis. The guards and prison staff were themselves overwhelmed. There were simply not enough personnel to control, feed, or manage such a massive population. Many were inexperienced or traumatized themselves, having survived the genocide. They worked in impossible conditions, often resorting to neglect as a survival mechanism. In some cases, prisoners were effectively left to self-regulate, with stronger groups controlling access to food, space, and water. Violence within the prison was common, though often overshadowed by the more pressing threat of disease and starvation. The architectural limitations of Gitarama exacerbated the overcrowding crisis. Unlike modern prisons with modular expansions, Gitarama was a colonial-era structure with fixed walls, narrow corridors, and no possibility for large-scale extension. It was never intended to house thousands of people for long periods. As the number of detainees continued to rise, the building itself began to degrade. Walls cracked, floors deteriorated, and makeshift partitions were built to create some semblance of organization. But they only added to the suffocating environment. Overcrowding at Gitarama became internationally infamous. Human rights observers, journalists, and NGOs who managed to enter the prison described scenes that resembled medieval dungeons rather than a modern detention facility. Photographs and testimonies painted a grim picture of a place where human bodies filled every available space, where disease and death were constant companions, and where the idea of rehabilitation or justice had been swallowed by sheer survival. The overcrowding of Gitarama Prison was not an isolated issue. It was a reflection of Rwanda's post-genocide reality, a broken legal system, a devastated country, and a desperate need for justice collided inside the walls of one building, creating one of the most extreme examples of prison overcrowding ever recorded. Inside Gitarama Prison, life for thousands of detainees quickly descended below any acceptable human standard. Overcrowding alone was deadly, but what truly made the prison infamous were the inhumane living conditions that developed as a direct result of mass detention, neglect, and the absence of basic resources. The prison transformed into a space where survival became the only goal, and human dignity was stripped away piece by piece. The first and most immediate challenge was space, or the lack of it. In cells designed to hold a handful of inmates, sometimes 50 or more people were crammed together. There was no room to lie down. Prisoners slept while standing or leaning against one another in a kind of exhausted, involuntary balance. During the day, they shuffled to make space for others to move. At night, they stood shoulder to shoulder in silence or moaned from fatigue. The floor itself became a contested resource, with prisoners struggling to secure even a small patch to stand on. Those who were weak, sick, or injured often ended up pushed toward the walls or corners, where air was most stagnant and conditions worst. Sanitation was almost non-existent. The prison's toilet facilities, intended for only a few hundred people, could not handle the waste of thousands. Latrines overflowed within weeks, filling the air with a constant stench of human waste. Wastewater pooled in corners and corridors, mixing with rainwater and leaking into cells. With no proper drainage system, these pools became breeding grounds for insects and disease. Prisoners often had to walk, stand, or sleep in areas contaminated by urine and feces. There were no regular cleaning routines. With such overcrowding, even basic hygiene became an impossible task. Water scarcity intensified the misery. The prison's water supply was designed for 400 inmates, not 7,000. Tanks emptied quickly, leaving thousands without access to clean drinking water for long periods. People resorted to collecting dirty water from puddles or sharing whatever small quantities they could find. The result was widespread illness. Dysentery, diarrhea, and waterborne infections spread rapidly through the population, claiming lives daily. A single bucket of clean water could spark fights among prisoners desperate for survival. Food was equally scarce and inadequate. Official rations were limited to a single daily meal, often consisting of thin cornmeal porridge or beans. Supplies were irregular and frequently spoiled by the time they reached the prison. Malnutrition became the norm. Prisoners lost weight rapidly, their bodies weakened, making them more vulnerable to disease. Some inmates described being so hungry that they chewed on pieces of clothing, wood, or anything they could find to ease the gnawing pain in their stomachs. Food distribution itself was chaotic. In the crowded courtyards, stronger prisoners pushed their way to the front while the weak were left behind. Guards, overwhelmed by the number of inmates, often had little control over who received food. Those unable to stand in line for hours or fight through the masses simply went hungry. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The prison had no capacity to handle the number of sick detainees. A small infirmary, meant to treat minor ailments for a few hundred prisoners, was flooded with patients suffering from severe illnesses. There were no adequate supplies of medicine, disinfectants, or clean bandages. Tuberculosis spread through the air in the crowded cells. Skin infections and sores, caused by constant standing and unhygienic conditions, went untreated. Small injuries often developed into life-threatening infections. Many prisoners developed gangrene from untreated wounds on their feet, caused by standing for days in filthy water. In extreme cases, inmates' feet rotted while they were still alive, a horrifying symptom of prolonged immobility and exposure to waste. Disease was everywhere. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid spread quickly in such unsanitary conditions. Malaria, carried by mosquitoes breeding in stagnant water, was a constant threat. The prison became a perfect environment for infectious diseases to thrive, hot, damp, and packed with vulnerable hosts. There was no way to isolate sick prisoners. Those who fell ill remained in the same cells as the healthy, accelerating transmission. In many cases, prisoners who collapsed from disease or exhaustion remained where they fell. Fellow inmates, unable to move freely, often had to step over the sick or dying just to get through the cell. The psychological toll of these living conditions was immense. Prisoners endured constant hunger, thirst, filth, and fear. Many had witnessed atrocities during the genocide and were now trapped in an environment that compounded their trauma. Some became numb, their identities reduced to mere survival. Others experienced severe mental breakdowns, hallucinations, or violent outbursts as their physical suffering turned into psychological torment. There were no mental health services, no counseling, and no escape. Light and air were also limited. Most cells were dimly lit or completely dark with little ventilation. Inmates often spent months without seeing sunlight. The air inside was thick, a mixture of sweat, excrement, and decay that clung to the skin and lungs. Breathing itself became a challenge in some areas, especially where ventilation was blocked by the sheer mass of human bodies. In rainy seasons, water leaked through the old colonial walls, soaking prisoners who had nowhere to move. In the dry season, the heat became suffocating, turning the cells into ovens where the risk of dehydration and heat exhaustion rose sharply. Corpses were a daily reality. With death rates so high, it was not unusual for bodies to remain in cells or courtyards for hours before removal. Overwhelmed, guards struggled to keep up with the number of deaths. Prisoners lived among the dead, their presence a constant reminder of their own precarious existence. Disease from decomposing bodies sometimes spread before removal teams could act, deepening the cycle of death and contamination. The guards themselves were trapped in this situation. Many were undertrained, underpaid, and working in horrifying conditions. They lacked resources and often resorted to neglect, turning a blind eye to suffering because they had no means to change it. Some were traumatized survivors of the genocide, placed in positions of authority over those accused of terrible crimes. This dynamic created an atmosphere of hostility. resentment, and fear that further poisoned the prison environment. In essence, Gitarama Prison during this period ceased to function as a detention facility and instead became a space of human degradation. Every basic necessity, air, water, food, space, medical care, was lacking. The building itself, never meant to house so many, amplified the suffering through its confined spaces and deteriorating infrastructure. For the thousands held inside, life became a relentless cycle of hunger, disease, filth, and fear. The conditions were so extreme that even seasoned human rights observers were shocked by what they saw. Reports described Gitarama as one of the most horrific detention centers in modern history, a place where the line between punishment and inhumanity had been completely erased. The unimaginable conditions inside Gitarama Prison inevitably led to one of the most horrifying consequences: staggeringly high death rates. Overcrowding, starvation, disease, and neglect converged to create a lethal environment where death became routine, an expected part of daily life. For many detainees, entering Gitarama was not the beginning of legal proceedings. It was the beginning of a slow, painful death behind walls that had become a tomb for thousands. From the moment the prison population surged in the wake of the 1994 genocide, mortality rates began to rise sharply. Gitarama was designed to accommodate around 400 prisoners, yet it housed over 7,000 detainees at its peak. This massive surge was far beyond the facility's capacity to provide even the bare minimum for survival. Prisoners were packed so tightly into cells that ventilation was almost non-existent, creating perfect conditions for infectious diseases to thrive. Death did not come suddenly for most. It was the result of prolonged exposure to hunger, filth, infection, and exhaustion. One of the most deadly factors was disease, which spread unchecked through the overcrowded prison. Dysentery and diarrhea were rampant because of contaminated water and inadequate sanitation. With no isolation for sick prisoners, diseases moved from one cell to another with terrifying speed. Tuberculosis, already present in Rwanda, found in Gitarama a breeding ground unlike any other. Prisoners coughed, spat, and blood in cells packed with hundreds of others, turning every breath into a potential threat. Malaria, cholera, and skin infections added to the suffering, but it was gangrene that became one of the prison's most shocking killers. Due to overcrowding, many prisoners were forced to stand for weeks or months, without the ability to lie down or even sit properly. Their feet were constantly soaked in dirty water and human waste. Open sores developed, then became infected. With no medical treatment, these infections worsened into gangrene, a condition where body tissue dies due to lack of blood flow or severe infection. In Gitarama, it wasn't uncommon for prisoners' feet to literally rot while they were still alive. The smell of decomposing flesh mixed with the stench of the overcrowded cells, creating an unbearable atmosphere. In many cases, gangrene spread so severely that the only way to save a life would have been amputation. But there were no medical facilities, no equipment, and no doctors to perform such procedures. Prisoners simply died where they stood, their bodies giving out under the combined weight of infection and exhaustion. Starvation and malnutrition were another major cause of death. Food supplies were never sufficient for the number of prisoners. Many inmates received only a single, small portion of watery porridge per day. Those who were weak sick or unable to push their way to the front of food lines often went days without eating. Their bodies wasted away, leaving them too frail to fight disease. Starved prisoners collapsed during the day and were trampled or simply left to die in corners of the cells. In such a place, food was not just nourishment, it was survival, power, and privilege. Those who managed to secure it lived a little longer. Those who didn't faded quietly into the mass of the dying. Dehydration also killed many. With water sources limited and often contaminated, prisoners drank whatever they could find, including stagnant puddles. In the heat of Rwanda's dry season, dehydration struck quickly. Prisoners collapsed from weakness, their lips cracked, their skin dry. their bodies failing. There was no systematic water distribution, and guards were overwhelmed. People died slowly of thirst in crowded cells, surrounded by others who were just as helpless. The lack of medical care transformed treatable illnesses into death sentences. Minor cuts turned into festering wounds. Diarrhea, which could have been treated with basic rehydration, became fatal. Respiratory infections spread rapidly, and without antibiotics or even proper rest, they killed at alarming rates. The prison's small infirmary could not handle thousands of patients. There were few, if any, trained medical staff on hand, and even humanitarian aid was limited during the early years. Prisoners often died waiting for help that never came. What made the death toll even more tragic was its sheer regularity. Death was not an exceptional event inside Gitarama. It was constant. According to reports from humanitarian groups and eyewitness accounts, dozens of inmates died every week, sometimes daily, during the peak years of overcrowding. Corpses were often left in cells or courtyards for hours, sometimes longer, before removal teams could take them away. The prison lacked the manpower and resources to bury bodies quickly. The dead were stacked and eventually taken out for mass burials, often without proper identification or record keeping. For many families, their relatives simply disappeared into the system, never to be heard from again. The psychological impact of these daily deaths on surviving inmates was profound. Living among the dying and the dead created an environment of hopelessness and numbness. Prisoners became accustomed to stepping over corpses on their way to get food or water. The distinction between life and death blurred. For some, death became a form of release from the relentless suffering. The cries of the sick and dying filled the air at night, echoing through overcrowded corridors, a grim chorus that became part of daily prison life. Guards and staff were overwhelmed by the scale of the mortality. They lacked training, resources, and often the will to intervene. Many were themselves traumatized by the genocide, forced into roles for which they were unprepared. Their response to rising death tolls was often passive. In some cases, prisoners were tasked with removing bodies themselves, dragging their dead cellmates out to the courtyards where corpses were piled until they could be taken away. The architectural structure of Gitarama amplified the death rates. Its old colonial design meant limited ventilation, poor drainage, and cramped spaces. Diseases that could have been mitigated in open areas spread quickly in confined cells. With no possibility for expansion, the population simply grew denser, and the death toll climbed. International human rights organizations began to raise alarms. Reports described Gitarama as a place where people go to die slowly. Journalists who were allowed to visit described horrific scenes: emaciated prisoners, festering wounds, bodies piled up, and the pervasive smell of rot. These accounts shocked the world, but did little to alleviate the immediate crisis. The Rwandan government, struggling to rebuild the country and process tens of thousands of genocide cases, simply did not have the capacity to fix the situation quickly. The result was one of the highest prison mortality rates in the world at that time. Gitarama became infamous not just for its overcrowding, but for the number of people who perished within its walls. Death in Gitarama was not caused by executions or violence alone. It was caused by neglect, disease, starvation, and the collapse of a system unprepared for the aftermath of mass atrocity. When the true scale of suffering inside Gitarama Prison began to surface, the Rwandan government and the international community were forced to confront a humanitarian disaster that they had neither fully anticipated nor prepared to manage. The prison's horrifying conditions were not simply the result of negligence. They were the byproduct of a nation shattered by one of the most rapid and brutal genocides of the 20th century. Rwanda's justice system had collapsed almost entirely in 1994. Leaving tens of thousands of alleged perpetrators and suspected collaborators with nowhere to go but overcrowded facilities like Gitarama. The response to this crisis unfolded slowly, unevenly, and under immense pressure from both domestic and international actors. Immediately after the genocide ended in July 1994, the Rwandan Patriotic Front (RPF) assumed control of a country in ruins. The infrastructure was devastated, government institutions were destroyed, and the legal system was practically non-existent. Thousands of judges, lawyers, and civil servants had fled, been killed, or were themselves accused of participating in atrocities. In this vacuum, the new government faced the monumental task of administering justice to an estimated 120,000 to 140,000 suspects. There were no functional courts, no lawyers to represent the accused, and no judges to try the cases. Prisons like Gitarama became holding centers for this massive population, but they were never equipped to handle such numbers. Initially, the government's response was largely reactive. The priority was to secure detainees and prevent escape rather than ensure humane living conditions. Resources were scarce. Rwanda was relying on emergency aid for food, medicine, and reconstruction. Many officials believed that the international community, which had failed to stop the genocide, would step in quickly to provide assistance for the post-genocide justice process. However, international attention in the first months after the genocide was focused more on refugee crises in neighboring countries, especially the camps in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, rather than the desperate situation inside Rwanda's prisons. It was international human rights organizations that first sounded the alarm about Gitarama. Groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the International Committee of the Red Cross (ICRC) began conducting inspections, interviewing prisoners, and documenting the appalling conditions. Their reports described overcrowded cells, disease outbreaks, starvation, and death on a massive scale. These reports were circulated globally, prompting criticism of both the Rwandan government and international donors for failing to act swiftly. The Rwandan government acknowledged the crisis, but its capacity to act was severely limited. In many ways, it was overwhelmed. Most of the national budget was being directed toward reconstruction, resettlement of refugees, and rebuilding essential services. Prisons, while horrifying, were seen as secondary to stabilizing the country. Officials argued that they simply did not have the means to construct new prisons or to process cases more quickly. This situation prompted international intervention, but even that came with complications. The United Nations, criticized for its inaction during the genocide, established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda (ICTR) in late 1994, based in Arusha, Tanzania. However, the ICTR was designed to prosecute only the top leaders and organizers of the genocide, not the thousands of ordinary suspects crammed into Rwandan prisons. Its proceedings were slow, expensive, and often disconnected from the urgent humanitarian crisis on the ground. Meanwhile, the ICRC began supplying food, medicine, and sanitation equipment to Gitarama and other prisons, helping to ease but not resolve the crisis. Red Cross workers provided medical treatment, distributed basic hygiene items, and pushed for the construction of latrines and better ventilation. Their efforts saved lives, but could not match the scale of the problem. Faced with mounting international criticism, the Rwandan government took several measures to address the situation. One of the earliest responses was to expand prison infrastructure. New facilities were constructed in various parts of the country, and some detainees were transferred out of Gitarama to reduce overcrowding. However, construction was slow due to limited funds, and the number of prisoners continued to grow faster than the capacity to accommodate them. Another significant response was legal reform aimed at accelerating the judicial process. In 1996, Rwanda passed laws that categorized suspects according to the severity of their alleged crimes. Those accused of planning or leading the genocide were placed in the most serious category, while others accused of less severe offenses were classified differently. This allowed the government to prioritize cases and release some detainees who were found to have insufficient evidence against them. Thousands were eventually freed through these legal reviews, which slightly reduced the pressure on prisons like Gitarama. Perhaps the most notable response came later with the revival of the Gacaca court system, a form of traditional community-based justice. Beginning in 2001, these courts allowed local communities to try lower-level genocide suspects, significantly speeding up the judicial process. This system, though controversial, was a direct response to the prison crisis. By involving communities in the legal process, the government could process thousands of cases in a fraction of the time it would have taken through formal courts. This innovation was partly driven by necessity. Without Gacaca, prisons like Gitarama might have remained permanently overcrowded for decades. The international community also provided financial and logistical assistance to support these reforms. Donor countries and NGOs funded the training of judges, the building of courtrooms, and the expansion of prison facilities. Some aid was specifically targeted toward improving prison conditions, food distribution programs, medical aid, and rehabilitation projects. However, this aid often came with political debates, as some critics argued that international donors were indirectly supporting a justice system that lacked due process protections. Despite these responses, change was gradual. Throughout the mid to late 1990s, conditions inside Gitarama remained dire. Death rates declined as some prisoners were transferred and aid increased, but the facility was still grossly overcrowded. Bureaucratic inefficiency, lack of trained personnel, and the sheer scale of the genocide's aftermath made rapid improvement nearly impossible. It took years before the prison population began to stabilize through legal reforms and releases. The government's stance also evolved over time. Initially defensive, officials began to publicly acknowledge the severity of the situation, welcoming international assistance more openly. By the early 2000s, Rwanda had taken more ownership of prison reform, though international organizations continued to play a crucial role in monitoring and funding improvements. Gitarama became a symbol, both of Rwanda's post-genocide struggles and of the international community's uneven response. On one hand, it revealed the desperate state of a justice system overwhelmed by unprecedented numbers. On the other, it showcased how a combination of international pressure, aid, and internal legal innovation gradually began to address the crisis. The story of Gitarama Prison is not confined to the past. Its legacy continues to shape Rwanda's justice system, international humanitarian law, and global debates on post-conflict accountability. What happened inside those overcrowded walls stands as both a warning and a lesson, a symbol of what can happen when justice systems collapse under the weight of mass atrocities, and a reminder of the moral and logistical challenges that follow genocide. One of the most striking aspects of Gitarama's legacy is how it exposed the fragility of justice in the aftermath of mass violence. In 1994, Rwanda faced a situation without precedent. A small, impoverished nation was tasked with processing the crimes of hundreds of thousands of people in the wake of a genocide that killed approximately 800 Zarahosan Tutsi and moderate Hutu in just 100 days. The existing legal infrastructure designed for normal peacetime crime rates simply could not absorb the tidal wave of arrests. Gitarama's overcrowding became a visible manifestation of this systemic collapse. It demonstrated that traditional justice mechanisms, when overwhelmed, can quickly transform from instruments of law into warehouses of human suffering. This realization influenced how Rwanda rebuilt its justice system in the years that followed. The government understood that conventional courts alone could not resolve such a vast backlog of cases. This led to the revival of the Gacaca courts, a community-based justice mechanism that sought to involve citizens in truth, telling, and accountability. Although Gacaca was born partly out of necessity to relieve prison overcrowding, it ultimately became one of the largest transitional justice experiments in modern history. Trying more than 1.2 million cases between 2001 and 2012, the Gitarama crisis indirectly pushed Rwanda toward this innovation, showing that alternative justice systems, though imperfect, can play a crucial role in post-conflict societies where formal structures are paralyzed. Gitarama also left a lasting imprint on international humanitarian advocacy. The shocking reports that emerged from the prison in the mid-1990s galvanized organizations such as the ICRC, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch to intensify their monitoring of detention conditions in post-conflict zones worldwide. Before Gitarama, much of the international attention in Rwanda was focused on the refugee crisis and the ICTR's prosecutions of high-level genocide architects. The discovery of prisoners dying from disease, starvation, and gangrene inside a state facility forced the world to confront a different, equally urgent crisis: the human cost of mass incarceration without due process. In this sense, Gitarama became a case study for humanitarian law and prison reform. It highlighted gaps in how international organizations respond to sudden spikes in detention populations after conflicts. Traditional humanitarian models were built for short-term emergencies, feeding refugees, providing medical care to war victims, not for managing tens of thousands of detainees in collapsing legal systems. Gitarama forced agencies to adapt their methods, leading to the development of new guidelines and intervention strategies for prisons in post-conflict societies. It taught the humanitarian sector that detention centers can become epicenters of mass suffering if not addressed early and aggressively. Another key part of Gitarama's legacy lies in how the Rwandan government and society have remembered, or sometimes not remembered, it. Official narratives in Rwanda have focused heavily on the genocide itself, the heroism of those who stopped it, and the country's remarkable recovery since the 1990s. By contrast, the story of Gitarama Prison has often remained on the margins. It is an uncomfortable chapter. It involves not only perpetrators of genocide, but also failures of the post-genocide state. Acknowledging the prison's horrors requires confronting the complexity of transitional justice, where victims and perpetrators, justice and suffering, can intertwine in morally difficult ways. While human rights organizations continue to document the history of Gitarama, public commemoration inside Rwanda tends to focus more on memorials to the genocide's victims than on the plight of those who perished in prisons afterward. Internationally, Gitarama stands as a lesson in the consequences of delayed action. The world failed to intervene during the genocide itself, and then failed again to quickly provide the resources and support necessary to handle its aftermath. The creation of the ICTR, while historically important, did not address the immediate humanitarian catastrophe in places like Gitarama. This has informed later responses to crises in other countries, such as Sierra Leone, Bosnia, and South Sudan, where international actors have sought to integrate humanitarian aid, legal support, and prison monitoring more quickly after conflicts to avoid repeating Rwanda's mistakes. Gitarama's legacy is also relevant to modern debates about mass incarceration and human rights. It raises fundamental questions. How should societies handle large populations accused of serious crimes when their legal systems are overwhelmed? What minimum standards of treatment must be maintained, even for those accused of participating in atrocities? The horror of Gitarama showed that when these questions are ignored or postponed, prisons can become sites of mass death, rivaling the brutality of the crimes they were meant to punish. These debates continue today as countries grapple with detaining suspected terrorists, war criminals, or insurgents in contexts where legal systems are fragile. The prison story also shaped Rwanda's own penal reforms in later years. As international pressure mounted, the government began to invest more heavily in prison infrastructure, legal training, and case processing. Over time, death rates in facilities like Gitarama decreased, and prison populations were reduced through a combination of trials, releases, and community-based justice. Today, Rwanda's prison system, though still criticized by some observers, operates under far more regulated conditions than in the immediate post-genocide years. Gitarama served as the grim catalyst for these reforms. Beyond law and policy, the legacy of Gitarama is deeply human. It is a story of thousands of men, many of them guilty of unimaginable crimes, but also thousands who were detained without trial for years, some without sufficient evidence. It is about individuals who died slowly from disease and neglect, forgotten by the world in a place where even basic human dignity had evaporated. Their suffering challenges simplistic narratives of good versus evil, reminding us that justice must never come at the cost of humanity, even in the aftermath of horrific violence. Finally, Gitarama stands as a symbol for future generations of leaders and humanitarian actors. It reminds the world that rebuilding a society after genocide is not only about holding perpetrators accountable, it is also about ensuring that the pursuit of justice does not create new humanitarian catastrophes. Legal systems must be rebuilt alongside humanitarian safeguards. International support must be swift, coordinated, and sustained. And perhaps most importantly, the dignity of all people, even those accused of grave crimes, must be upheld to prevent history from creating new cycles of suffering.